The auctioneer's gavel slammed against the podium, and Serafina Blackthorne felt her world shatter into 1,000 pieces. Sold to Mr. Matthias Ravencrest for the sum of $50,000. The words echoed through the courthouse in Willowbrook, Connecticut, where her father's debts had finally caught up with her. 3 weeks after Cornelius Blackthorne's sudden death, his creditors had descended like vultures, claiming everything from the family silverware to the clothes on her back. But this wasn't an auction for property or possessions. This was an auction for her hand in marriage. Serafina stood frozen between two court bailiffs, her hands trembling as she watched a tall figure in an expensive charcoal suit rise from the back row. Matthias Ravencrest moved with calculated precision through the crowd of leering bidders who had come to purchase themselves a young bride. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his jaw clean-shaven, and his cold blue eyes swept over her with the same detached interest one might show when examining livestock. "The marriage contract will be executed immediately," announced Judge Caldwell, shuffling through a stack of legal documents. "Miss Blackthorne, you are hereby legally bound to Mr. Ravencrest to satisfy the outstanding debts of your deceased father's estate." The courthouse erupted in murmurs and whispers. Some of the men who had been bidding against Ravencrest looked disappointed, while others seemed relieved they wouldn't have to explain a teenage bride to their wives. Serafina caught fragments of their conversations as they filed out. 50,000 for that little mouse? Ravencrest must be desperate. Could have gotten 3 girls for that price down in Hartford. Strange fellow, that one. Lives like a hermit up in that mansion of his. Judge Caldwell cleared his throat and fixed Serafina with a stern look. "Miss Blackthorne, do you understand the terms of this arrangement?" She wanted to scream that she understood nothing, that 3 weeks ago she had been planning her sophomore year at Fairfield College, not standing in a courthouse being sold like cattle. Instead, she managed a barely audible, "Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Ravencrest has agreed to assume all debts totaling $73,000 in exchange for your hand in marriage. The ceremony will take place this afternoon at his residence. Mrs. Henderson will escort you to prepare." A plump woman in a navy dress stepped forward, her expression sympathetic but resigned. She had overseen dozens of these debt marriages since the economic troubles began affecting families throughout Connecticut. "Come along, dear. We'll get you ready." As Mrs. Henderson guided her toward the courthouse exit, Serafina caught sight of Matthias Ravencrest speaking quietly with his lawyer. The man looked to be in his early 30s, with an austere face that revealed nothing about his intentions. He hadn't spoken a single word to her, hadn't even acknowledged her presence beyond that initial cold assessment. The ride to the Ravencrest mansion took 40 minutes through winding roads lined with oak trees. Mrs. Henderson attempted small talk, but Serafina couldn't focus on anything beyond the reality that she was about to marry a complete stranger. Her father had never mentioned anyone named Ravencrest, and she had certainly never seen the man before today. The mansion appeared suddenly through a break in the trees, an imposing stone structure that looked more like a fortress than a home. Gothic spires reached toward the overcast sky, and dozens of windows stared down at the approaching car like unblinking eyes. The grounds were immaculately maintained, with manicured hedges and flower beds that must have cost more than most people earned in a year. "Mr. Ravencrest values his privacy," Mrs. Henderson explained as they pulled up to the front entrance. "The staff has been instructed to assist you with anything you need." A butler opened the car door and helped Serafina onto the gravel driveway. The man was at least 70 years old, with silver hair and the kind of formal bearing that suggested he had been serving wealthy families his entire life. "Miss Blackthorne, I am Jeremiah. I've prepared the blue room for you to change into your wedding attire." Wedding attire. As if this were a normal wedding between two people who loved each other, not a financial transaction disguised as matrimony. The interior of the mansion was as impressive as the exterior, with marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and oil paintings that probably cost more than her father's entire estate. Jeremiah led her up a sweeping staircase to a bedroom that was larger than the entire first floor of her childhood home. A wedding dress hung on the wardrobe door, made of cream-colored silk with delicate lace trim. It was beautiful, expensive, and completely wrong for what this marriage actually represented. As she changed into the dress, Serafina tried to process everything that had happened. 3 weeks ago, Her biggest concern had been choosing her fall semester classes. Now she was putting on a wedding dress to marry a man who had purchased her like a piece of property. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Blackthorne, it's time." The ceremony took place in the mansion's library, a room lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound books that probably hadn't been read in decades. A justice of the peace waited beside an ornate fireplace, while Matthias Ravencrest stood with his hands clasped behind his back, staring out one of the tall windows. He had changed into a black tuxedo that fit him perfectly, emphasizing his tall frame and broad shoulders. When he turned to face her as she entered the room, those cold blue eyes showed no emotion whatsoever. No nervousness, no anticipation, no warmth. Nothing. The ceremony lasted exactly 12 minutes. They exchanged vows that neither of them meant, signed documents that made their union legally binding, and became husband and wife without ever having had a real conversation. When the justice of the peace pronounced them married, Matthias made no move to kiss his new bride. Instead, he simply nodded once and said, "Thank you, Judge Morrison. Jeremiah will see you out." As the officials departed, Seraphina found herself alone with her husband in the echoing silence of the library. The weight of the wedding ring on her finger felt like a shackle, and the reality of her situation began to sink in with terrifying clarity. She was trapped. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Seraphina stood in her wedding dress, feeling more like an intruder in a museum than a bride in her new home. Matthias remained by the window, his profile sharp against the late afternoon light filtering through the heavy curtains. "We need to talk," he said finally, his voice carrying none of the warmth one might expect from a groom on his wedding day. He moved to a leather chair beside the fireplace and gestured for her to sit across from him. The formality of it struck her as absurd. They were married now, legally bound, yet he treated her like a business associate he barely tolerated. Seraphina perched on the edge of the chair, her hands folded in her lap. The wedding dress rustled with every small movement, reminding her of the charade they had just performed. "You're probably wondering why I paid so much for you," Matthias began, his directness cutting through any pretense of politeness. The words stung, even though she had been thinking the same thing. The thought had crossed my mind. Your father owed money to some very dangerous people, men who wouldn't hesitate to sell you to far worse situations than this one. He leaned back in his chair, studying her with those unsettling blue eyes. "I prevented that from happening. How noble of you." The sarcasm slipped out before she could stop it. His mouth twitched, almost as if he found her defiance amusing. "I didn't do it out of nobility, Miss Blackthorne. I had my own reasons." "Mrs. Ravencrest," she corrected, gesturing to the ring on her finger. "And what reasons might those be?" Matthias was quiet for a long moment, and she watched something shift in his expression. The cold calculation gave way to something darker, more complex. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost hesitant. "Tell me about your father. What did he tell you about his past?" The question caught her off guard. "What does that have to do with anything?" "Everything." He stood and walked to a painting hanging above the mantelpiece. It depicted a stern-looking man with dark hair and piercing eyes, dressed in clothing from several decades past. "Did he ever mention having any family besides you?" Seraphina frowned. "He said my mother died when I was born and that he had no siblings. We were all we had." She paused, studying Matthias's tense posture. "Why are you asking me this?" Instead of answering, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document. He handed it to her without a word. Her hands shook as she unfolded the paper. It was a birth certificate, yellowed with age. The name at the top made her blood run cold. Matthias Cornelius Ravencrest. But it was the name listed under father that made the world tilt beneath her feet. Cornelius James Blackthorne. "That's impossible," she whispered, staring at the document. "This has to be some kind of mistake." "I'm afraid it's not." Matthias returned to his chair, his movements careful and controlled. "Cornelius Blackthorne was my father too, Seraphina. We're half-siblings." The birth certificate slipped from her numb fingers and fluttered to the floor. The room seemed to spin around her as the implications crashed over her like a wave. The marriage ceremony they had just completed, the legal documents they had signed, the vows they had exchanged. "You knew," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You knew, and you married me anyway. I had to. It was the only way to protect you." She shot to her feet, the wedding dress tangling around her legs. Protect me? You married your own sister. Half-sister, he corrected, though the distinction felt meaningless in the face of what they had done. And yes, I'm aware of how this looks. How this looks? Her voice rose to near hysteria. This is sick. This is wrong. This is illegal in most states, yes. His calm response only fueled her panic. But not in Connecticut, as long as we don't consummate the marriage. The word hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Consummation. The very reason marriages existed, the physical union that would make their bond complete in the eyes of both law and society. So what happens now? She asked, sinking back into the chair. We live here together, pretending to be a happy couple while knowing we're related by blood. We live here together because you have nowhere else to go, and because the men your father owed money to will kill you if they find you. Matthias's voice hardened. As for pretending to be happy, I doubt anyone expects that from an arranged marriage. Serafina buried her face in her hands. 24 hours ago, she had been a college student with a normal life and a future full of possibilities. Now she was trapped in a marriage that was both illegal and impossible, bound to a man who shared her blood. Why didn't you tell me before the ceremony? She asked through her fingers. Because you would have refused, and then you'd be dead within a week. The bluntness of his words made her look up. You really think they would kill me? I know they would. Your father borrowed money from Vincent Caruso. He paused to let the name sink in. You've heard of him, I assume? Everyone in Connecticut had heard of Vincent Caruso. The man ran most of the illegal gambling operations from Hartford to New Haven, and his methods of collecting debts were legendary for their brutality. How much did my father owe him? $30,000. Plus interest and penalties, it had grown to nearly $60,000 by the time he died. But you paid $73,000 at the auction, because Caruso wasn't the only one your father owed money to. Matthias stood and moved to a cabinet, pulling out a crystal decanter filled with amber liquid. He poured 2 glasses and offered one to her. There were gambling debts, loan sharks, back taxes, and a mortgage that was 3 months behind. Serafina accepted the glass but didn't drink. The alcohol smell was sharp and unfamiliar. How do you know all this? Because I've been watching your family for years, waiting for the right time to make contact. He took a sip of his drink, grimacing slightly. I hired investigators to keep track of Cornelius's finances. When he died and left you vulnerable to his creditors, I saw an opportunity. An opportunity to do what? To finally confront him about abandoning my mother and me. His voice carried a bitter edge. But he died before I could get that satisfaction. The weight of everything he was telling her pressed down like a physical force. Her father, the man she had trusted and loved, had apparently lived an entire secret life. He had fathered another child and abandoned them, accumulated debts to dangerous criminals, and left her to face the consequences of his choices. What happened to your mother? She asked quietly. She died when I was 16. Cancer. He finished his drink and set the glass down with more force than necessary. She spent 20 years waiting for Cornelius to come back, to acknowledge me as his son. He never did. Maybe he didn't know about you. Matthias's laugh was harsh and humorless. He knew. I have letters he wrote to her, promising to leave his wife and marry her instead. Empty promises that kept her hoping until the day she died. Serafina felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. He was married when you were born? To your mother, yes. I was the result of an affair he had with my mother, Evangeline Ravencrest. She was 22 when she got pregnant, naive enough to believe he would choose her over his respectable wife. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, creating a picture that made her stomach turn. Her father had cheated on her dying mother, fathered a child he refused to claim, and then spent the rest of his life running from his responsibilities. So you bought me to get revenge on him, she said, understanding dawning. I bought you to keep you alive, he corrected. The revenge was supposed to come later, when I confronted him about what he had done to my mother. But death cheated me out of that satisfaction. Serafina set down her untouched glass and looked around the opulent library. Books that probably cost more than most people made in a month lined the walls, while priceless artwork decorated every available surface. The wealth surrounding her was staggering, especially compared to the modest life she had lived with her father. How did you afford all this? She asked. If he abandoned you and your mother, where did the money come from? My mother's family had money. Old money, from shipping and railways. When she died, I inherited everything." He gestured around the room. All of this was supposed to be meaningless without justice for what he did to her. And now I'm stuck with a wife I can never touch and a revenge I can never complete. He met her eyes across the space between them. "We're both trapped, Serafina. The only question is whether we can find a way to make this bearable." The enormity of their situation settled over her like a shroud. They were married, but could never truly be husband and wife. They were family, but strangers. They were bound together by law and circumstance, but separated by blood and the sins of their father. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the library floor. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sound of servants preparing dinner, the normal rhythms of household life continuing despite the chaos that had just been unleashed. "What happens now?" she asked again. But this time the question carried the weight of their shared future. "Now we learn to live with what we've done," Matthias said, "and we pray that nobody ever discovers the truth." 3 weeks had passed since their wedding, and Serafina had settled into an uncomfortable routine at the Ravencrest mansion. She occupied the east wing while Matthias kept to his study and the master bedroom on the opposite side of the house. They shared meals in awkward silence, exchanged polite pleasantries when they encountered each other in the hallways, and maintained the facade of a newly married couple for the benefit of the household staff. But the tension between them was suffocating. Serafina spent most of her days in the mansion's extensive library, losing herself in books to avoid thinking about her situation. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was hiding in the same room where they had been married, surrounded by thousands of volumes that belonged to a man she could never truly know. On this particular morning, she was researching property law when Matthias appeared in the doorway. He looked haggard, as if he hadn't slept properly in days. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his usually immaculate appearance was slightly disheveled. "We need to talk," he said, holding up a manila envelope. "I've discovered something about your father's death." She looked up from her book, noting the grim expression on his face. "What kind of something?" "The kind that suggests he didn't die of natural causes." He moved to the chair across from her desk and sat down heavily. "I hired a private investigator to look into his affairs. The official cause of death was listed as a heart attack, but there are inconsistencies in the medical examiner's report." Serafina closed her book and gave him her full attention. "What kind of inconsistencies?" Cornelius was in excellent health for a man his age. No history of heart problems, normal blood pressure, and he had just passed a complete physical examination 2 months before he died. Matthias opened the envelope and spread several photographs across the desk. More importantly, there were traces of digitalis in his bloodstream. Digitalis? A plant extract that can cause heart failure if administered in the right doses. In small amounts, it's used to treat heart conditions. In larger doses, it's virtually undetectable poison. The photographs showed her father's study, but something was wrong with the scene. Papers were scattered across his desk in a way that seemed unnatural, and several drawers had been left partially open. "Someone searched his office after he died," she said, studying the images. "That's what I think too. The question is what they were looking for." Matthias leaned back in his chair. "I believe your father was murdered, Serafina, and I think I know who did it." A chill ran down her spine. "Who?" "Aldrich Thornfield." The name meant nothing to her, but Matthias's expression suggested it should. "I've never heard of him. He's a real estate developer who's been buying up property throughout this area for the past 5 years. He's particularly interested in land with historical significance or development potential." Matthias pointed to one of the photographs. "Your father owned 40 acres of prime woodland that Thornfield has been trying to acquire. My father never mentioned selling any land, because he refused to sell. Multiple times, according to the investigator's report, Thornfield made increasingly aggressive offers, but Cornelius wouldn't budge." Serafina studied the photographs more closely, trying to imagine her father's final moments. Had he known he was in danger? Had he realized someone was trying to kill him? "Why are you showing me this?" she asked. "What does it matter now? He's dead, and I've already lost everything." "Because Thornfield is still out there, and he's still interested in that land. Land that now belongs to you." "That's impossible. Everything was sold to pay his debts." Matthias shook his head. The 40 acres were held in a separate trust, one that Thornfield apparently didn't know about. "According to the will, the property transfers directly to you. bypassing the estate entirely. The implications hit her like a physical blow. If Matthias was right, then she wasn't as powerless as she had believed. More importantly, her father's killer was still free, probably believing he had gotten away with murder. "What do you want to do about it?" she asked quietly. "I want to prove that Thornfield killed your father, and I want to make him pay for it." There was something in his voice that made her look at him more carefully. The cold detachment he usually maintained had cracked, revealing something raw and angry underneath. "This isn't just about justice for my father, is it?" she said. "This is personal for you." Matthias was quiet for a long moment, staring at the photographs spread across the desk. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Thornfield has been after my property too. He's made offers on this estate 3 times in the past 2 years. Each time, his representatives made it clear that refusal wasn't really an option." "What kind of threats?" "The kind that make you wonder if you'll wake up in the morning." He met her eyes across the desk. "I think Thornfield has killed before, Serafina. Your father might not be his first victim." The room seemed to grow colder as the weight of his words sank in. They weren't just dealing with a greedy developer or even a simple murderer. They were potentially facing someone who had made killing a business strategy. "What evidence do we have?" she asked. "Not enough for the police, but enough to start building a case." He gathered the photographs and slipped them back into the envelope. "The investigator is still working on it, but I think we can find more if we work together." "Work together how?" "By searching your father's study ourselves. If Thornfield's people were looking for something specific, there's a chance they missed it." Serafina considered the proposal. The idea of returning to her childhood home, now standing empty and probably scheduled for demolition, filled her with dread. But the possibility of finding justice for her father outweighed her reluctance. "When do we go?" "Tonight. After dark." The hours until nightfall crawled by with agonizing slowness. Serafina tried to read, but her mind kept wandering to what they might find in her father's study. She had always thought of him as a simple man with simple pleasures, but the revelations of the past few weeks had shattered that image completely. Matthias appeared at her door just after 10 o'clock, dressed in dark clothing and carrying a flashlight. "Are you ready?" The drive to her childhood home took 20 minutes through back roads that Matthias seemed to know well. When they pulled up to the modest 2-story house where she had grown up, Serafina felt a stab of grief so sharp it took her breath away. The house looked abandoned and forlorn in the moonlight. The garden her father had tended so carefully was already becoming overgrown, and several windows had been boarded up to prevent vandalism. "The power has been turned off," Matthias said as they approached the front door. "We'll have to rely on flashlights." He produced a set of lockpicks from his pocket and made quick work of the front door. Within minutes, they were standing in the hallway where Serafina had said goodbye to her father for the last time. The house smelled of dust and neglect, but underneath that was the faint scent of her father's pipe tobacco and the lavender soap he had always used. The familiar smells brought tears to her eyes, and she had to steady herself against the wall. "His study is upstairs," she said when she trusted her voice again. They made their way up the creaking staircase, their flashlight beams dancing across walls lined with family photographs. Serafina caught glimpses of herself at various ages, always with her father's arm around her shoulders, both of them smiling at the camera. The study door was already open, and the room beyond was exactly as it appeared in the investigator's photographs. Papers scattered across the desk, drawers pulled out, books knocked from their shelves. "Start with the desk," Matthias said, moving toward the built-in bookcases. "Look for anything that seems out of place or hidden." Serafina began sorting through the scattered papers, most of which appeared to be routine correspondence or household bills. But as she worked her way through the pile, she began to notice something strange. "Matthias, look at this." She held up a letter dated just 1 week before her father's death. It was written on expensive letterhead bearing the name Thornfield Development Corporation. "Mr. Blackthorne," she read aloud, "this is our final offer for the Willowbrook property. Failure to respond within 7 days will force us to pursue alternative methods of acquisition. We trust you will make the right decision for your daughter's future." "Alternative methods," Matthias repeated grimly. "That sounds like a threat." "There's more." She had found a second letter, this one handwritten. "It's from someone named Vincent Caruso." Matthias went very still. "Read it." "Cornelius, you have 24 hours to produce the money you owe me. or I will be forced to collect payment from your daughter instead. I understand she is quite lovely. It would be a shame if something happened to that pretty face." The letter slipped from her numb fingers. 2 separate threats, both delivered within days of her father's death. The pressure he must have been under was unimaginable. "He was trying to protect me," she whispered, "and it got him killed." As they continued searching, Serafina found herself thinking about the father she thought she had known versus the man these documents revealed. He had made mistakes, terrible ones that had cost him his life and nearly destroyed hers. But in the end, he had been trying to shield her from the consequences of his choices. "Serafina, come here." Matthias was standing beside her father's desk, examining what appeared to be an antique clock. But as she approached, she could see that he had discovered something hidden behind the clock face. "There's a compartment back here," he said, working his fingers around the edges. "I think your father hid something inside." With a soft click, a small panel swung open, revealing a space just large enough to hold a few folded papers. Matthias carefully extracted the documents and spread them on the desk. The first was a map of the local area with several properties marked in red ink. The second was a list of names and dates that meant nothing to Serafina. But the third document made both of them freeze. It was a birth certificate, yellowed with age and bearing an official seal. But this wasn't Matthias's birth certificate. This one belonged to someone named Lysander James Blackthorne, born the same year as Cornelius. "Your father had a twin brother," Matthias said slowly. Serafina stared at the document, her mind racing. He never mentioned having a brother. He always said he was an only child. Look at the date of death. Someone had written in red ink across the bottom of the certificate. "Died. October 15th, 1987, Willowbrook Memorial Hospital." "That's 2 years before you were born," Matthias said. But Serafina was staring at something else on the birth certificate, something that made her blood run cold. Listed under distinguishing marks was a single line, crescent-shaped scar on left palm. She grabbed Matthias's left hand and turned it over. There, clearly visible in the flashlight beam, was a crescent-shaped scar on his palm. Their eyes met in the darkness, and she saw her own shock reflected in his face. Everything they thought they knew about their situation, about their relationship, about their father, was suddenly in question. If Lysander was Matthias's father, then Cornelius wasn't. Which meant, "We're not related," she breathed. The revelation hung between them like a spark in a room full of gasoline, dangerous and full of possibility. The drive back to the mansion passed in tense silence. Serafina sat rigid in the passenger seat, her mind reeling from the discovery of Lysander's birth certificate. The document lay in her lap like a piece of evidence that could either free them or destroy them, depending on whether they could prove its authenticity. Matthias gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Every few seconds, she caught him glancing at her, as if he were seeing her for the first time. The careful distance they had maintained for 3 weeks had evaporated in an instant, replaced by something far more dangerous. "We can't be certain," he said finally as they pulled through the mansion gates. "One birth certificate doesn't prove anything. For all we know, your father forged it to cover up some other secret." "You have the scar," she pointed out. "Exactly as described on the certificate. Scars can be coincidental." But his voice lacked conviction, and they both knew it. The crescent-shaped mark on his palm was too specific, too perfectly matched to be dismissed as mere chance. They entered the mansion through the kitchen entrance, hoping to avoid the night staff. The fewer people who knew about their midnight expedition, the better. But as they reached the main hallway, Jeremiah appeared from the shadows like a disapproving ghost. "Mr. and Mrs. Ravencrest," he said formally, though his tone carried a note of concern. "You have a visitor waiting in the library." Matthias stopped abruptly. "At this hour? Who is it?" "Mr. Aldrich Thornfield, sir. He arrived approximately 30 minutes ago and insisted on waiting for your return." Serafina felt the blood drain from her face. The man they suspected of murdering her father was sitting in their library, probably examining the same books where they had been married just weeks ago. "Did he say what he wanted?" Matthias asked, his voice carefully controlled. "He mentioned something about a business proposition that couldn't wait until morning." Jeremiah's expression suggested he didn't approve of visitors who arrived unannounced after 10 o'clock. "I took the liberty of serving him brandy." "Thank you, Jeremiah. We'll handle it from here." As the butler disappeared back into the shadows, Matthias turned to Serafina. Stay behind me and don't say anything unless I specifically ask you to. Thornfield is dangerous, and we can't let him know we suspect him of anything. They walked toward the library together, and Serafina could feel her heart pounding against her ribs. She had never met the man who might have killed her father, and the thought of sitting across from him while pretending everything was normal made her stomach churn. The library doors were closed, but warm light spilled from underneath them. Matthias paused with his hand on the handle, taking a deep breath before pushing the doors open. Aldrich Thornfield stood with his back to them, examining the oil painting above the fireplace. He was a tall man with silver hair and an expensive suit that probably cost more than most people earned in a month. When he turned to face them, Serafina was struck by how ordinary he looked. She had expected someone obviously sinister, but Thornfield could have been any successful businessman. Mr. and Mrs. Ravencrest, he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Thank you for seeing me at such a late hour. I hope you don't mind the intrusion. Not at all, Matthias replied smoothly. Though I admit I'm curious about what brings you here so urgently. Business, I'm afraid. The kind that requires privacy and discretion. Thornfield's gaze shifted to Serafina, and she felt as if she were being evaluated by a predator. Congratulations on your recent marriage, by the way. Such a romantic story, the way you swept her away from that unfortunate auction. There was something in his tone that suggested he knew more about their situation than he was letting on. Serafina forced herself to remain silent, but her hands clenched into fists at her sides. What can we do for you, Mr. Thornfield? Matthias asked. I represent a consortium of investors who are very interested in developing this area. We're prepared to make extremely generous offers for certain properties. He moved to the desk where they had been examining evidence just hours ago. Properties like this estate, for instance. The estate isn't for sale. Everything is for sale, Mr. Ravencrest. It's simply a matter of finding the right price. Thornfield opened a leather briefcase and extracted a thick folder. I'm authorized to offer you $2 million for the Ravencrest property. Cash, with a 30-day closing. It was a staggering sum, far more than the estate was worth on the current market. The size of the offer itself was suspicious, suggesting that Thornfield needed the property for something more than simple development. That's very generous, Matthias said carefully. But as I said, we're not interested in selling. I see. Thornfield's smile grew colder. Perhaps you'd like some time to discuss it with your lovely wife. I understand she recently inherited some property of her own from her late father. Serafina's blood turned to ice. If Thornfield knew about the 40 acres, then he also knew that her father's death hadn't accomplished what he had hoped. I'm not sure what you're referring to, she said, breaking her silence despite Matthias's warning. The Willowbrook property, of course. 40 acres of prime woodland that would be perfect for our development plans. Thornfield pulled another folder from his briefcase. We're prepared to offer $500,000 for that parcel as well. Mrs. Ravencrest hasn't decided what to do with that property yet, Matthias interjected. Of course, these things take time. Thornfield closed his briefcase with a sharp click. But I should mention that time is somewhat of a factor in this situation. What do you mean? I mean that certain interested parties are becoming impatient with the delays in this project. The kind of people who don't take no for an answer very gracefully. His eyes found Serafina again. I'd hate for anything unfortunate to happen to such a young bride. The threat was delivered with the same casual tone one might use to discuss the weather, but its meaning was crystal clear. Refuse to sell and face the consequences. That sounds almost like a threat, Mr. Thornfield, Matthias said, his voice dangerously quiet. A threat? Heavens no. Simply a statement of fact about the realities of business in this area. Thornfield moved toward the door, then paused as if remembering something. Oh, and Mr. Ravencrest? You might want to be more careful about your evening activities. Willowbrook can be dangerous after dark, especially for people who visit places they shouldn't. The words hit like a physical blow. He knew. Somehow, Thornfield knew they had been to her father's house tonight. Thank you for the advice, Matthias replied evenly. Think about my offer. Both of you. Thornfield opened the library doors. I'll be in touch in a few days for your answer. He left as abruptly as he had arrived, and they listened to his footsteps echo through the hallway until the front door closed behind him. Only then did Serafina allow herself to breathe again. He was watching us, she said, sinking into the nearest chair. He knew we were at my father's house, which means he's been having us followed. Matthias moved to the window and peered through the curtains. We need to assume that everything we do from now on is being monitored. What do? We be very, very careful. He turned back to face her, and she could see the determination in his eyes. And we find a way to prove he killed your father before he decides to kill us too. The game had begun in earnest, and the stakes were their lives. But now they had something Thornfield didn't know about. The possibility that they weren't siblings after all. If they could prove Lysander was Matthias's real father, it would change everything about their situation. The question was whether they could uncover the truth before Thornfield's patience ran out completely. The discovery of Lysander's birth certificate had changed everything between them, creating a tension that crackled through the mansion like electricity before a storm. For 2 days after Thornfield's visit, Serafina found herself watching Matthias with new eyes, noticing things she had forced herself to ignore before. The way he moved with unconscious grace through the hallways. The quiet intensity in his voice when he spoke to her. The moments when their hands accidentally brushed while examining documents, sending unexpected heat racing through her veins. If they weren't siblings, then everything they had denied themselves was suddenly possible. But the uncertainty was torturous, hanging over them like a sword while they waited for proof that might never come. Matthias had contacted a genealogist in Hartford who specialized in authenticating historical documents, but the process would take weeks. In the meantime, they were trapped in limbo, married but unable to touch, drawn to each other but paralyzed by doubt. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday morning when Serafina found Matthias in his study, staring at Lysander's birth certificate with an expression of desperate longing. "We can't keep living like this," she said from the doorway. He looked up, and she saw her own frustration reflected in his eyes. Living like what? Pretending we don't feel anything for each other. Pretending that document doesn't change everything. She stepped into the room and closed the door behind her. "We're married, Matthias. Legally, completely married. And there's a very good chance we're not related at all. A chance isn't certainty. Nothing in life is certain." She moved closer to his desk, her heart pounding. "But I know how I feel when I look at you. I know what happens when you're near me. And I know that if we wait for absolute proof, we might wait forever." Matthias stood abruptly, putting distance between them. "And if we're wrong? If the genealogist proves that Cornelius was my father after all? Then we deal with it when it happens." She followed him across the room, refusing to let him retreat. "But I won't spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been." He turned to face her, and she could see the war playing out in his expression. Desire battled with caution, hope struggled against fear. "Serafina, you don't understand what you're asking." "I understand perfectly." She reached out and touched his face, feeling him tense under her fingertips. "I'm asking you to take a chance on us. I'm asking you to stop treating me like a sister and start treating me like a woman." For a moment, she thought he might give in. His hand covered hers, and she felt him lean into her touch. But then he pulled away, stepping back as if her proximity burned him. "I can't. Not until we know for certain." The rejection stung more than she had expected. "Fine. Then I'll make the choice for both of us." "What do you mean?" "I mean I'm leaving." The words came out before she had fully formed the thought, but once spoken, she realized they were true. "I can't stay here anymore, Matthias. Not like this." His face went white. "You can't leave. Thornfield is still out there, and nothing." She moved toward the door, her decision crystallizing with each step. "I'd rather take my chances with him than slowly go insane living in the same house with a man I can't have. Serafina, please. Be reasonable." "Reasonable?" She whirled around to face him. "There's nothing reasonable about any of this. I was sold like livestock, married to a man who might or might not be my brother, and now I'm supposed to live the rest of my life in limbo while you agonize over possibilities. I'm trying to protect you. From what? From happiness? From love?" Tears of frustration burned her eyes. "My father spent his whole life running from his mistakes, and look where it got him. I won't make the same choice." She left the study before he could respond, her vision blurred by tears she refused to shed. The mansion felt like a prison now, beautiful and luxurious, but ultimately a cage that kept her from living the life she wanted. In her room, she began packing the few belongings she had brought with her. Most of her clothes had been provided by Matthias's staff, expensive gowns and dresses that belonged to the role of Mrs. Ravencrest. She left them hanging in the wardrobe, taking only the simple things that were truly hers. A knock at the door interrupted her packing. She expected to see Matthias, but instead found Jeremiah standing in the hallway with his usual formal demeanor slightly cracked by concern. "Mrs. Ravencrest, might I have a word?" She gestured him into the room, noting how his eyes took in the open suitcase and scattered belongings. "You're leaving," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "May I ask why?" Serafina paused in her packing, surprised by the butler's directness. In the weeks she had lived at the mansion, Jeremiah had been unfailingly polite but distant, the perfect servant who saw everything and said nothing. "It's complicated. Most worthwhile things are." He moved closer, and she could see genuine kindness in his weathered face. "I've worked for the Ravencrest family for 37 years, Mrs. Ravencrest. I knew Matthias's mother, and I've watched him struggle with the burden of his parentage his entire life." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that young man has spent so long believing he was unwanted and illegitimate that he's forgotten how to accept good things when they come to him." Jeremiah's voice grew gentle. "He cares for you more than he's ever cared for anyone, but he's terrified of destroying the one pure thing in his life. The uncertainty is destroying us both. Then perhaps it's time to eliminate the uncertainty." Serafina looked at him sharply. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I knew Lysander Blackthorne." The butler's words hit her like a physical blow. "He worked here briefly, just before his death, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that Matthias has his eyes." The room seemed to spin around her. "You knew? All this time? You knew he wasn't Cornelius's son?" "I suspected." The resemblance was too strong to ignore. Jeremiah's expression grew sad. "But it wasn't my place to say anything. Matthias needed to discover the truth for himself." "Does he know you're telling me this?" "No. And I prefer to keep it that way, at least for now." The butler moved toward the door, then paused. "But perhaps you might mention to him that there are people in this house who knew his real father. People who could provide the certainty he craves without waiting for genealogists and laboratory results." After Jeremiah left, Serafina sat on her bed in stunned silence. The truth had been within reach all along, hidden in the memories of a loyal servant who had watched the family's secrets unfold for decades. But even with this knowledge, she couldn't bring herself to unpack her suitcase. Matthias needed to make his own choices, and she needed to make hers. If he wanted her to stay, he would have to ask. If he wanted their marriage to be real, he would have to take the leap of faith himself. The sound of a car engine outside her window drew her attention. Through the rain-streaked glass, she could see a black sedan parked near the mansion's entrance. Two men in dark suits stood beside it, their attention focused on the building with predatory intensity. Thornfield's men. Her blood turned to ice as she realized what their presence meant. Time had run out. Thornfield was no longer content to wait for their answer to his offers. She grabbed her phone and called Matthias, but the call went straight to voicemail. Racing from her room, she ran through the hallways toward his study, her heart pounding with fear that had nothing to do with their personal struggles. The study was empty, but she could hear voices coming from the library below. Masculine voices, speaking in tones that made her skin crawl with apprehension. As she crept down the stairs, she could make out words that confirmed her worst fears. "Mr. Ravencrest has had sufficient time to consider our offer. Our employer is no longer interested in negotiations." She had to warn him, had to find a way to help him before Thornfield's patience finally ran out completely. But as she reached the bottom of the stairs, a hand closed over her mouth from behind, and she realized she might be too late. The hand over Serafina's mouth belonged to Jeremiah, and his urgent whisper in her ear made her freeze with relief and terror in equal measure. "Stay quiet and follow me. There's another way out." He led her through the servants' passages that honeycombed the mansion, narrow corridors she had never known existed. They emerged in the kitchen, where Jeremiah quickly gathered supplies into a canvas bag. "Where's Matthias?" she whispered. "Safe, for the moment, but not for long." He handed her a set of car keys. "There's a service road behind the greenhouse that leads to the main highway. Take my car and drive to the address I've written here." She looked at the paper he pressed into her hand. It contained an address in Hartford along with a name, Isadora Whitmore. "Who is she?" "Someone who's been investigating Thornfield longer than your husband has. Someone who can provide the answers you both need." Jeremiah's expression was grim. But first, there's something I must tell you about Lysander Blackthorn. Can it wait? No, because if something happens to me tonight, you'll need to know the truth. He gripped her shoulders. Lysander didn't die in a hospital, Mrs. Ravencrest. He was murdered, just like your father. And the man who killed him is in your library right now. The revelation hit her like a physical blow. Thornfield killed Matthias's father too? 28 years ago, Lysander had discovered something about Thornfield's business practices, something that would have destroyed him. So Thornfield arranged an accident that looked like a heart attack. Jeremiah's voice carried decades of suppressed anger. I was the one who found the body. I knew it wasn't natural, but I couldn't prove it. Why didn't you tell someone? Who would believe a butler's suspicions against a respected businessman? I had no evidence, no proof. He moved toward the kitchen door, listening for sounds from the main house. But I kept watching, waiting. And when your father died the same way, I knew Thornfield was killing again. The sound of raised voices echoed from the library, and Jeremiah's expression grew urgent. You must go now. Find Isadora Whitmore and tell her everything. She has resources we don't, connections in law enforcement who might actually listen. What about Matthias? I'll get him out safely, I promise you. But if Thornfield takes you both, no one will be left to expose the truth. Against every instinct screaming at her to stay and help, Seraphina slipped out the kitchen door into the rainy night. The greenhouse loomed ahead of her like a glass cathedral, and beyond it, she could see the narrow service road Jeremiah had mentioned. The drive to Hartford felt endless, every set of headlights in her rearview mirror making her heart race with the fear that Thornfield's men were following her. But she reached the address safely, pulling up to a modest brick building that housed several small offices. Isadora Whitmore's nameplate indicated she was a private investigator, but the woman who answered the door looked more like a college professor. She was in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun and intelligent brown eyes that missed nothing. Mrs. Ravencrest, I've been expecting you. Expecting me? Jeremiah called 20 minutes ago. Come in quickly. Isadora's office was cluttered with filing cabinets, computer equipment, and walls covered in photographs and documents connected by colored string like something from a detective movie. But one wall in particular made Seraphina's breath catch. It was covered entirely with information about Aldrich Thornfield. Photographs, newspaper clippings, financial records, and what appeared to be surveillance footage spanning several decades. I've been investigating Thornfield for 15 years, Isadora said, noting her stare. Ever since he killed my brother. Your brother? Detective Michael Whitmore. He was getting too close to proving Thornfield's connection to several suspicious deaths in the area. Isadora moved to her desk and opened a thick file. Your father and Lysander Blackthorn weren't his only victims, Mrs. Ravencrest. I've documented at least 12 deaths over the past 25 years, all people who stood in the way of Thornfield's business interests. The scope of it was staggering. Thornfield wasn't just a murderer. He was a serial killer who had been operating for decades with complete impunity. Why hasn't anyone stopped him? Because he's careful, methodical, and extremely wealthy. He makes his victims' deaths look like accidents or natural causes, and he's very good at covering his tracks. Isadora pulled out a manila folder. But you and your husband have given me something I've never had before. Living witnesses who can connect him to recent crimes. What do you mean? I mean that Thornfield made a mistake when he threatened you both directly. For the first time, we have someone who can testify about his methods. Isadora opened the folder to reveal audio equipment. Jeremiah has been recording conversations in the mansion for months, including tonight's confrontation. He's been recording everything? On my instructions. We've been building a case, gathering evidence, waiting for the right moment to strike. Isadora's expression grew determined. That moment is now. She pressed play on a digital recorder, and Thornfield's voice filled the room with chilling clarity. Mr. Ravencrest, I think you misunderstand your situation. This isn't a negotiation anymore. It's a simple matter of mathematics. You give me what I want, or you and your lovely wife join her father in the cemetery. Matthias's voice came next, strained but defiant. And if I refuse, then I'll be forced to demonstrate the same creativity I showed with Cornelius Blackthorn. Did you know that Digitalis is completely undetectable if administered correctly? Your wife will simply appear to have died of a weak heart, just like her dear father. The casual admission of murder made Serafina's hands shake. Here was the proof they needed, recorded in Thornfield's own voice. "There's more," Isadora said, fast-forwarding through the recording. "Listen to this. You killed Lysander Blackthorn too, didn't you?" Matthias's voice was deadly quiet. Thornfield's laugh was cold and amused. "Lysander was a romantic fool who thought he could expose my business practices to the authorities. He never understood that some secrets are worth killing for. You destroyed 2 families. I protected my interests, just as I'm protecting them now." There was a pause. Then Thornfield's voice grew menacing. "Your father-in-law learned too late that crossing me has consequences. I trust you'll be wiser." The recording ended, leaving the office in stunned silence. They had it. They finally had evidence that could destroy Thornfield and bring justice for all his victims. "We need to get this to the police immediately," Serafina said. "Already done. Detective Sarah Chun is on her way to the mansion with a warrant for Thornfield's arrest." Isadora checked her watch. She should be there within the hour. "What about Matthias? Is he safe?" "Jeremiah will keep him alive until the police arrive. The man has been preparing for this moment for years." Isadora's expression grew gentle. "But there's something else you need to know, something about your husband's parentage." She pulled out another file, this one containing DNA test results and genealogical charts. "I had samples of Lysander's DNA from evidence stored after his death. When Jeremiah told me about your discovery, I compared it to a sample he obtained from Matthias." Serafina's heart stopped. "And Lysander Blackthorn was definitely Matthias's biological father. There's no question about it." Isadora smiled. "You're not related to your husband at all, Mrs. Ravencrest. Your marriage is completely legal and legitimate." The relief was so overwhelming that Serafina had to sit down. All the guilt, all the uncertainty, all the agonizing over their situation had been for nothing. They were free to love each other without shame or fear. "Does Matthias know?" "Not yet, but he will soon." Isadora gathered the files and recording equipment. "Right now, our priority is making sure Thornfield doesn't escape justice again." As they prepared to return to the mansion, Serafina felt a mixture of hope and terror. The truth about their relationship had finally been revealed, but Matthias was still in danger. The question was whether they would reach him in time. The police convoy approached the Ravencrest mansion with sirens silent, but lights flashing against the rain-soaked night. Detective Sarah Chun had assembled a team of 8 officers, all armed and prepared for the possibility that Thornfield might resist arrest violently. Serafina sat in the passenger seat of Isadora's car, watching the mansion grow larger through the windshield. Every light in the building appeared to be on, casting an eerie glow against the storm clouds overhead. "Remember," Detective Chin's voice crackled through the radio, "Thornfield is extremely dangerous and has killed at least 12 people that we know of. Do not underestimate him." As they pulled up to the mansion's entrance, Serafina could see movement through the library windows. Shadows passed back and forth behind the curtains, suggesting that the confrontation inside was still ongoing. "Stay in the car," Isadora told her firmly. "Let the police handle this." But Serafina was already opening her door. "That's my husband in there. And he'll stay alive longer if you don't give Thornfield another hostage to use against him." The wisdom of Isadora's words warred against Serafina's desperate need to know that Matthias was safe. In the end, love won over logic, and she slipped out of the car before anyone could stop her. The front door stood ajar, and she could hear voices coming from the library. Moving as quietly as possible, she crept through the familiar hallways toward the sound of confrontation. "You're making this much more difficult than it needs to be, Mr. Ravencrest." Thornfield's voice carried the patient tone of a man accustomed to getting his way. "Simply sign the papers, and this will all be over." "And if I refuse?" Matthias sounded tired but defiant. "Then I'll be forced to arrange another tragic accident. Perhaps a gas leak this time. So much more dramatic than a simple heart attack." Serafina peered around the corner and saw the scene in the library. Matthias sat in a chair facing Thornfield, while 2 armed men in dark suits flanked the doorway. Jeremiah was nowhere to be seen, and she prayed the loyal butler had escaped safely. "Where's my wife?" Matthias asked. "Safe, for the moment, as long as you cooperate." Thornfield moved to the desk and spread out legal documents. "These papers will transfer ownership of both the Ravencrest estate and the Willowbrook property to my development company. all perfectly legal and above board. Except for the part where you murdered my wife's father to get them. Thornfield's laugh was cold. Prove it. I don't have to. The police will do that for me. The police? Thornfield seemed genuinely amused. Mr. Ravencrest, I've been avoiding police investigations for 25 years. What makes you think this time will be any different? The sound of footsteps in the hallway made everyone in the room freeze. Detective Chun appeared in the doorway with her weapon drawn, followed by 3 other officers. Aldrich Thornfield, you're under arrest for the murders of Cornelius Blackthorne, Lysander Blackthorne, and conspiracy to commit murder. For a moment, the tableau held perfectly still. Then Thornfield's expression shifted from surprise to calculating rage. Detective Chun, how unexpected. His voice remained calm, but Seraphina could see the fury building behind his eyes. I'm afraid you're interrupting a private business meeting. The business meeting is over. Chin moved further into the room, her officers spreading out to cover the exits. Step away from Mr. Ravencrest and put your hands where I can see them. Thornfield's men reached for their weapons, but they found themselves outgunned and surrounded. One by one, they raised their hands in surrender. This is all very dramatic, Thornfield said, making no move to comply with Chin's orders. But I'm curious about what evidence you think you have against me. Your recorded confession, for starters. Chin nodded to one of her officers, who began reading Thornfield his rights. We have you on tape admitting to multiple murders. Recorded by whom? Thornfield's eyes narrowed dangerously. Surely you don't expect a court to accept evidence obtained illegally. The recording was made by the homeowner with full legal authority to monitor conversations in his own house. Chin's smile was cold, completely admissible in court. For the first time since the police had arrived, Thornfield's composure cracked. His gaze swept the room, looking for an escape route that didn't exist. You have no idea what you're interfering with, he said, his voice rising. This development project involves people far more powerful than a small-town detective. Then they can hire you a good lawyer. You're going to need one. As the officers moved to arrest Thornfield, he suddenly lunged toward Matthias with a knife that had appeared from nowhere. But Jeremiah materialized from behind the bookshelf like an avenging ghost, striking Thornfield's wrist with a heavy candlestick and sending the weapon flying across the room. That's for Lysander, the butler said grimly as Thornfield collapsed to his knees. The arrest was completed without further violence, though Thornfield continued to make threats and promises of legal retribution as he was led away in handcuffs. His men were also taken into custody, their weapons confiscated as evidence. Detective Chun approached Matthias, who was still sitting in his chair as if unable to believe the ordeal was over. Are you injured, Mr. Ravencrest? No. Shaken, but unharmed. He looked around the room as if seeing it for the first time. Is my wife safe? I'm here. Seraphina stepped out of the shadows where she had been hiding, and Matthias was on his feet instantly, crossing the room to pull her into his arms. I thought they had taken you, he whispered against her hair. Jeremiah got me out. He saved us both. They held each other in the aftermath of terror, surrounded by police officers and crime scene technicians, but aware only of their shared relief at having survived. Mr. and Mrs. Ravencrest, Detective Chun said gently, we'll need full statements from both of you, but that can wait until tomorrow. Tonight, you should rest. As the police finished their work and the mansion slowly returned to normal, Seraphina found herself alone with Matthias in the library where everything had begun. The room that had witnessed their wedding, their discoveries, and now their salvation. Isadora Whitmore has something to tell you, she said, taking his hands in hers. About your parentage. About us. His eyes searched her face, hope and fear warring in his expression. What about us? We're free, Matthias. Free to love each other without shame or guilt. She smiled through tears of relief. Lysander was your father. We're not related at all. The revelation broke something loose inside him, and she saw years of rigid self-control finally crumble. When he kissed her, it was with all the passion they had denied themselves, all the love they had been afraid to feel. Outside, the storm was finally breaking, and morning light began to filter through the library windows. The nightmare was over, and their real life together could finally begin. 6 months later, Seraphina stood in the same library where her nightmare had begun, but everything about the room felt different now. Sunlight streamed through windows that had been cleaned of their shadows, and fresh flowers from the garden filled the air with the scent of new beginnings. Thornfield's trial had been swift and decisive. The recorded confession, combined with Isadora's 15 years of evidence and DNA analysis linking him to multiple crime scenes, had resulted in multiple life sentences without possibility of parole. His development empire had crumbled overnight, and the properties he had tried to steal through murder were finally safe. But the legal victory, satisfying as it was, paled in comparison to the personal transformation that had followed. "Are you ready for this?" Matthias asked from the doorway, looking devastatingly handsome in a charcoal gray suit that complemented his dark hair and blue eyes. Today they were renewing their wedding vows, but this time it would be a celebration of love rather than a transaction born of desperation. The first ceremony had been about survival. This one was about choosing each other freely, with full knowledge of who they really were. "I've been ready for months," she said, smoothing the silk of her new wedding dress. This one was ivory rather than cream, with delicate beadwork that caught the light as she moved. More importantly, it was a dress she had chosen herself, for a wedding that meant everything to her. The guest list was small but meaningful. Detective Chun had become a friend during the months of testimony and legal proceedings. Isadora Whitmore sat in the front row like the protective older sister Serafina had never had. And Jeremiah, who had been promoted from butler to family confidant, beamed with the pride of a man who had helped save the people he loved. Judge Morrison, the same justice of the peace who had performed their first ceremony, stood ready to officiate again. But his demeanor was completely different this time, warm and genuine rather than perfunctory. "Dearly beloved," he began, "we are gathered here today to witness something remarkable. The transformation of a marriage of necessity into a union of choice, convenience into love, obligation into joy." Serafina looked into Matthias's eyes and saw her own happiness reflected there. The last 6 months had been a revelation, discovering each other without the shadow of forbidden attraction hanging over them. They had learned that they shared the same dry sense of humor, the same love of old books and quiet evenings. They complemented each other in ways that went far deeper than physical attraction, though that certainly existed in abundance. "Do you, Matthias, take Serafina to be your wife, chosen freely this time, to love and cherish not out of obligation, but out of the deep affection that has grown between you?" "I do." His voice was steady, but she could see the emotion in his eyes. "I choose you, Serafina, not because circumstances forced us together, but because I can't imagine my life without you in it." "And do you, Serafina, take Matthias to be your husband, knowing that this choice is yours alone to make, free from the constraints that bound you before?" "I do." She smiled through tears of joy. "I choose you, Matthias. I choose us. I choose the life we're going to build together." When Judge Morrison pronounced them husband and wife this time, Matthias didn't hesitate. He pulled her into his arms and kissed her with all the passion they had denied themselves for so long, to the delighted applause of their small gathering. The reception was held in the mansion's garden, where Jeremiah had outdone himself with arrangements of white roses and twinkling lights strung between the trees. It felt like a fairy tale, magical and perfect in a way their first wedding had never been. As the evening progressed, Serafina found herself standing with Isadora near the fountain that served as the garden's centerpiece. "Any regrets?" the investigator asked with a knowing smile. "About which part? The arranged marriage, the murder plot, or falling in love with a man I thought was my brother?" "Any of it. All of it." Serafina considered the question seriously. The past year had been the most terrifying and transformative of her life. She had lost her father, discovered terrible truths about his past, and faced dangers she could never have imagined. But it had also brought her Matthias, this life, and a love deeper than anything she had dreamed possible. "No," she said finally. "No regrets at all. If I hadn't been sold at that auction, I never would have met him. If Thornfield hadn't threatened us, we might never have discovered the truth about Lysander. Every terrible thing that happened led us to this moment." That's a remarkably philosophical way to look at attempted murder and psychological torture. Maybe, but I've learned that sometimes the worst situations create the best opportunities for change. She watched Matthias across the garden, deep in conversation with Detective Chun about some aspect of Thornfield's case that was still being resolved. "I was a sheltered college student 6 months ago. Now I'm a woman who knows what she wants and isn't afraid to fight for it. And what you want is him. What I want is the life we're building together. The trust, the partnership, the way he makes me feel like the strongest version of myself." Serafina smiled. "The passion doesn't hurt either." Isadora laughed. "I don't think I needed that much detail." As the reception wound down and the guests began to depart, Serafina and Matthias found themselves alone in the garden. The lights twinkled overhead like stars, and the fountain provided a gentle background melody to the perfect evening. "So, Mrs. Ravencrest," Matthias said, pulling her close, "what would you like to do with the rest of our lives?" "Everything," she said without hesitation. "I want to travel and see the world beyond Connecticut. I want to finish my education and maybe start a foundation to help other women in situations like mine. I want to fill this house with laughter and children and love." "That sounds like an excellent plan." He kissed her forehead gently. "Though I'd like to add something to the list." "What's that?" "I want to wake up every morning grateful that fate brought us together, even in the most impossible circumstances." His voice grew serious. "You saved me, Serafina, not just from Thornfield, but from a life of isolation and bitterness. You taught me that love is worth taking risks for." "We saved each other," she corrected, "and we're going to keep saving each other for the next 50 years. As they walked hand in hand back toward the mansion, Serafina reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, she had been sold like property to satisfy her father's debts. Tonight, she was walking into a future filled with infinite possibilities, beside a man who loved her completely. The mansion that had once felt like a prison now felt like home. The man who had once been forbidden to her was now her partner in every sense of the word. And the love that had seemed impossible was now the foundation of everything they would build together. Some fairy tales, she realized, were worth the darkness that preceded them. Some love stories were worth every obstacle that tried to prevent them. Theirs was definitely one of them.